Hello, good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. I would love to thank John Goldsmith of the Roberts Bridge Club for having us here with the space and the great broadband. It gives us the ability to put on the show. Thank you to our members. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to continue with these productions. And thank you very much to Alan Judd for his time putting together this presentation and spending it with us this evening. Onward with the show.
Thank you. Well, as you know, I'm going to talk this evening about what I call the Romney Marsh gang. Well, they weren't really a gang of writers, and I don't know what we should call a group of writers, whether they're a flock or a swarm or a murmuration or maybe even a whinge sometimes anyway. But this was a group of writers who lived on or near the Romney Marsh in our sort of area in the first decade of the last century. They weren't organized, but what they had in common was that they all knew each other and they saw themselves as part of a great cultural endeavor, but they didn't all interpret it in quite the same way. Some of them saw themselves as writing the novel with great capital letters. Others saw themselves as taking a much more workmanlike and utilitarian approach to what they were doing. Two of the people we're going to look at never actually lived here at all, but they were frequent visitors. They breathed the same literary air and they influenced the others. So the ones we're going to talk about are Rudyard Kipling, Henry James, Ford Madox Ford, Joseph Conrad, Stephen Crane, H.G. Wells, Violet Hunt, and Edith Wharton. Now, there are others that we could talk about, such as E. Nesbit, E.F. Benson, Radcliffe Hall, Noel Coward, Sheila K. Smith. They were all local writers, but they were either here at different times, or if they overlapped, they didn't feature significantly in the lives of those we're looking at. Why were they here? Why this part of the world? There's no single reason, but it's partly chance, partly marriage, and partly acquaintance, but largely because of the railways, the telegraph, and the telephone. The railways in particular meant that you could maintain your writing and publishing career and your life without being in the metropolis. You could get there easily, people could get to you easily. Henry James, who lived in Rye, frequently had people down to have lunch with him, and it took about 2 hours from Charing Cross to Rye. And nowadays, I checked the other day, actually, and they quote 1 hour, 47 minutes or 2 hours and 6 minutes. So nothing much has changed in just over a century. You could be here, pursue a writing career without feeling cut off, and you could perhaps live more agreeably and cheaply. So let's go on, first of all, to Rudyard Kipling. Well, can we have the first screen, the first shot, please? Kipling, there he is, with those little pebble glasses. Now, he had no permanent home until he came here to Bateman's in Burwash, which I imagine you all know, in 1902, and he stayed there until his death in 1936. He'd been born in India, and he'd been schooled here in the West Country from the age of 6 to 17. But when he came here and explored England, it was as if it was a foreign country. I mean, he says, he and his wife now discovered England, which we had never done before. It is the most marvelous of all foreign countries that I have ever been in. And they fell in love with Bateman's at first sight, not surprisingly. It's a very attractive house. If I can do this right, we'll have a look at it there. As Kipling says, at the very first sight, we said, that's her, the only she, a good and peaceable place, standing on terrace lawns, nigh to a walled garden of old red brick, and 2 fat-headed oast houses with red brick stomachs. Well, that's pretty much what it's like now. They came there from America, where they'd spent a not very happy time following the loss of all their money in a banking collapse. But Kipling, fortunately, was an extremely successful writer and made his money back again. Now, much of his best work was written at Bateman's, But Puck of Pook's Hill and Rewards and Fairies are the two books that most reflect the direct influence of Bateman's and Sussex in his work. He actually writes about this place and this area. Indeed, two of the stories in Friendly Brook and the Wish House are told in what is apparently very accurate rendition of the then Sussex dialect. Kipling was never part of any group of writers in a very groupy sense. He was always on the fringes of groups, but throughout his life it was like that. When he was at school, he was too short-sighted to play games. When he was a journalist in India, which is how he started out, he was accused of going native for writing too much about the Indians. He was never really part of the Sussex gentry, but he was probably the most successful of all the writers we're looking at. Perhaps H.G. Wells may be on a par, more or less, but probably not quite. And his very success led to a certain amount of cattiness sometimes on the part of the others. He was also technologically the most modern and the most interested, apart from Wells, again, who was like him, liked to be up with new developments. They would both, in these days, be adept at Zoom and anything to do with IT. Kipling was an early adopter of electricity and motoring. Of course, you can see his Rolls-Royce at Bateman's now. He was perhaps also the writer with the single greatest natural facility for words and rhythm and ear. Now I'm going to read a short extract, which is Ford Madox Ford, one of the other writers we're looking at, who is writing about an account of what Henry James says about Kipling. And Ford was a very good mimic of other people's styles, and we can trust what he says about James's style and the tone of his remarks pretty well absolutely, although often Ford is historically inaccurate. Anyway, this is what he says, his rendition of Henry James talking about Kipling. So, says Mr. James, Mr. Kipling has just been to see me. Such are the rewards of an enviable popularity that Mr. Kipling is in possession of a magnificent 1,200 guinea motor car. In the course of conversation on the characteristics of motor cars, Mr. Kipling uttered words which have for himself no doubt a particular significance, but which to me at least convey almost literally nothing beyond their immediate sound. Mr. Kipling said that the motor car was calculated to make the Englishman, now came the humorous gasp and the roll of the eyes, was calculated to make the Englishman think. Mr. James abandoned himself to low chuckling. He then continued, the magnificent 1,200 guinea motor car, after having this evening conveyed its master and mistress to Bateman's Burwash, of which the proper pronunciation is Burridge, would tomorrow devotedly return here to convey me and my nephew William to Burridge in time for lunch, returning here in time for me to give tea to my friend Lady Maud Warrender. And all was gas and gingerbread when in rushes the chauffeur. And in short, the chauffeur has omitted to lubricate the wheels of the magnificent 1,200 guinea motor car, with the result that its axles have become one piece of molten metal, the consequence of which is that its master and mistress will return to Burwash, which should be pronounced Burridge, by train, and the magnificent 1,200 guinea motor car will not devotedly return at noon, and will not, in time for lunch, convey me and my nephew William to Burwash, and will not return here in time for me to give tea to my friend Lady Warrender, which, concluded the master, with subdued ho-hos of merriment, is calculated to make Mr. Kipling think. See what I mean about their cattiness occasionally. Now, Henry James himself, he too lived in what is now a National Trust House, Lamb House in Rye, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. I don't know whether it's open at the moment because times have changed a bit. He moved there in 1898 at the age of 55, having rented the old vicarage in Church Square in Rye, in the corner, very nice looking house. He fell in love with Rye the moment he visited it, calling it the little old cobblestone, grass-grown, red-roofed town a kind of little becoming high-doored, brass-knockered facade to one's life. I may retire to it with a certain shrunken decency and wither away. Well, that's what he liked to say. But James's life was as much a facade as any house he owned, and this is the only one he owned. He was anything but withering away. He lived a very sociable life, although he certainly liked to say he didn't, and perhaps liked to think he didn't. It wasn't just sociability, it was also money. His great friend Edith Wharton, another novelist whom we'll come to later, discerned in him what she called the pride that apes humility. He was in terror of being thought rich, worldly, or luxurious. He was forever contrasting his visitors' supposed opulence and self-indulgence with his own hermit-like asceticism. You see, James believed himself to be what he called invincibly unsaleable. And it is true that his books did not sell well, certainly not compared with Edith Wharton's. I mean, her first novel enabled her to buy a large and luxurious motor car, a Panhard, whereas James, The Wings of the Dove, which was one of his great late novels and still much read now, sold only enough, he said, to buy himself a handcart in which to bring guests' luggage up from Rye Station. He could never forget that. However, he didn't live badly in Lamb House. He was actually much less poor, richer even, than he thought. There were 4 servants. There was a gardener. James, by the way, was what he called densely ignorant of gardening. And although the servants weren't everything they should be, a couple of them were alcoholics and had to be got rid of after much trouble. But he improved, the servants improved, and he had a conscientious cook who left an anecdote saying that he was very absent-minded. And she recalled vividly one day going out to buy some fish. I think it was probably some cod that he'd ordered. And he was out on his morning constitutional around the town, and she ran into him. And she went up to him and started telling him why she couldn't get any cod that day, but she got another kind of fish. And she said that as I looked at him, I could see his face thinking, who is this woman talking to me about fish? Why is she talking to me about fish? He was pretty hopeless where that sort of thing was concerned. He'd go off to a party somewhere. He'd meet a couple. He'd take a shine to them. He'd invite them to lunch on Sunday. He'd then not tell anyone he'd invited them to lunch on Sunday and would forget all about it until they turned up. Another of his servants was a young man called Burgess Noakes, whom I wonder if anyone here knows any family called Noakes, because it's still a local name. And Burgess Noakes was, I believe, a bantamweight boxing champion. So he might have been an ancestor of someone whom we all know here. Now, James, as he got on in life, he developed tennis elbow. And that meant that he couldn't write anymore. So he took to dictating his novels, and he dictated to a secretary on a typewriter. And he had a series of secretaries, male and female. And the typewriters they used, first of all, were Remingtons. And he got used to the rhythm of the Remingtonese, as he called it. He rather liked the Remington. And when the Remington had to go and be repaired, and they had an Underwood, he couldn't get on with that at all, because he said the rhythm was quite different. Again, I'm going to quote Ford Madox Ford again, giving us a rendition of what it was like to listen to James dictating his novels. So this is Ford doing James. James would say, no, Miss Dash, that is not clear. Insert before we all are. Let me see. Yes, insert not so much locally, though to be sure we're here, but temperamentally in a manner of speaking. So that the phrase, Ford says, blindingly clear to him by this time, when completed, would run, so that here, not so much locally, though to be sure we're here, but at least temperamentally in a manner of speaking, we all are. Clear to James, but not very clear to the reader, at least without 2 or 3 different readings. Now, Ford Madox Ford himself, he was a Londoner. He was a young man. He'd been brought up in a very literary and artistic world in London. His grandfather was Ford Madox Brown, the pre-Raphaelite painter. He married on elopement a young lady called Elsie Martindale, and she was the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Martindale, who then lived in Winchelsea. They lived in the glebe in Winchelsea. And for most of the time, from 1900 to 1910, Ford and Elsie, with their young children, lived just along the road from the glebe. They lived, if we have a photo of Ford, I just show you that first of all. Are we getting there? We're nearly there. Yes, we're coming there soon. I've caught him by surprise. That's Henry James, by the way. I should have done that. And that's the Lamb House, of course, as you will know. Let's go to the next one. And that is the garden room where James used to dictate. But it was destroyed by a bomb in the Second World War, as we'll see in the next photo. Yes, there it is, clearing up after the bomb. And now we should be able to come on to Ford, usually photographed with a cigarette in his mouth. And this would have been roughly at the time when he was in Winchelsea, probably a bit later. They lived in a house called the Bungalow in Winchelsea. The next one. Now, that's another one. That is Ford with, on our left is Ford, then with James Joyce and Ezra Pound, and an American gentleman called John Quinn. Now, perhaps we can get to, yes, that was Ford's house in Winchelsea. It was called the Bungalow then. It's now called the Little House. And in those days, it had a veranda on the front with hops growing along it. And it's got a plaque on it to him. His wife, Elsie, had an appendix operation on the kitchen table in it whilst they were there. That was not that unusual in those days. People often had operations at home, and it may have been cleaner than going to the hospital. She built an extension at the back, which took up most of the back garden. Importantly, one of the great events of this period in literary terms was that Ford and Joseph Conrad, whom we're going to talk about, collaborated together. Conrad, I'll go on about it in a minute much more, but was an older man than Ford. He was 41 and Ford was 24. Conrad was Polish and he wasn't very confident about writing in English. And he collaborated with Ford partly as a result, as a reason to get that expertise going, and partly also, I think, because he felt that Ford had an entree into literary society. And some of the time they were collaborating here in Winchelsea. At other times it was further out on the Marsh. Now, we always think of writers or anyone famous in the past, we think of them as doing what they're known for. So politicians, we think of them in Parliament or whatever it is. But it's easy to forget that their lives are just like everyone else's in every other respect. They suffer the same daily trials and tribulations. So here is Ford writing to his mother about the very well-known Victorian actress, Ellen Terry, who was a family friend and who also lived in Winchelsea one time. He says, "Ellen Terry was in the other day. She asked to be remembered to you. She's, poor thing, getting groggy and old, rheumatic, troubled with failing memory and eyesight, and I'm afraid with failing purse too. James too has been very ill and isn't any more his charming self. Conrad," he goes on to say, "had gout and toothache, and Elsie, his wife's tubercular knee had caused her to fall and badly break her arm in one of the town gates of Winchelsea. Stephen Crane had TB, which he was going to die of. Ford himself had indigestion and sleeplessness and eventually a nervous breakdown. Yet, he wrote 17 books during those 10 years in Winchelsea." With Kipling, he was probably the only one to write in any serious extent about the locality and about the local people on the Marsh and around here. He wrote a book about the Cinque Ports, and in his memoirs, he did vivid renditions of conversations with what he called the brown flotsam of the country roads. For example, there was a lady kind of tramp lady called Mary Walker, who sought to fend off cancer by tying a hot brick under her breast and was always determined to keep all on going. There was a tramp called Carew who named prisons he'd been in after countries and workhouses he'd been in after towns. And of course there was Ragged Ass Wilson, named for his threadbare garments, nether garments. And of Ragged Ass Wilson, Ford wrote That man never stopped working. He could lay bricks, cut out rafters, plaster, hang paper, paint, make chairs, corner cupboards, fish, poach, snare, brew, gather simples, care for poultry, stop foxes' earths. There was nothing he could not do but write. And later in life, he taught himself to read. He had his meals with me. Where he slept, I never knew. I think he was happy. He also wrote about Shaking Ben, who was described as the village idiot and who was fed by the local villagers and said to have been ruined by the bad girls of Rye. Less sentimentally, he commented on the widespread ignorance that he found amongst many ordinary people, which he reckoned was made much worse than it would have been by the drift of people to the towns and the cities. He says, there are whole stretches of England where a really full-witted or alert youth of between 16 and 30 will absolutely not be found. Of the labourer, he says, his diet is atrocious. It is atrociously cooked. His cottage is insanitary, damp and too small. His work is too hard. His opportunities for mental relaxation pitifully restricted. Such virtues as he has in spite of his environment. His vices are nearly all the product of his hard life. You cannot expect much from a man whose function in life is no more than to keep on going. And the wonder is how he does it. Right, next photo, please. We'll have that, by the way, is the cottage where Joseph Conrad stayed opposite the little house in Winchelsea. You can see it now. And that is Ford, again, with a different lady this time. I won't go into Ford's love life, but he had roughly 4 wives. You might, if you consider people he lived with for 10 years or more, a wife. He couldn't marry them because he and Elsie were never divorced. And that is Janice Biala, who was 27 years younger than him and a Polish Jewish artist, and whom I met when I was writing a biography of Ford. She was in her 90s then and a very feisty lady. Next one, please. And that is Ford with Janice Biala again. You can see the difference. Next one, please. That now is Joseph Conrad, suitably with a nautical background. Now, Conrad, he lived at a farmhouse called Pent Farmhouse, which is across the other side of the marsh, Postling, near Hythe. And he lived there from 1898 to 1909. The house was found for him by Ford, who had himself lived there for a while and renting it. And he sublet it to Conrad, who didn't always pay the rent, actually. Now, Conrad, as I said, was Polish, and he joined the British Merchant Navy, and he spent his youth and early manhood sailing all over the world. And that is, those trips and life at sea are mostly the subject of his books later, though not entirely. He thought in French, he said, and he wrote in English. I'm told he had a very guttural way of speaking, and he would pronounce the E at the ends of words where we don't. So he would say that these are things, or those are things. He's described as having high cheekbones jutting out a little, which revealed his Eastern European origin, just as his strong, square figure and his walk showed him a sailor who never seems to find the solid earth a quite familiar footing after a sloping deck. Something there was about him, both of the court and of the quarterdeck, an air of courtesy and high breeding, and yet with something of command. Now, his collaboration with Ford, I've already mentioned. They collaborated on 3 books. None of them are the best books that either wrote. And it worked well for a while. It achieved the purpose that each had in a way. I think it kept Conrad, it gave him the confidence to go on writing in English. And it helped Ford find himself. But Conrad was always a bit two-faced about the collaboration. He would praise it to Ford and do quite the opposite to other people. And indeed, other writers thought it was a very bad thing. H.G. Wells, cycled across from Sandgate to express his disapproval. And Henry James said to Elsie, Ford's wife, "To me, this is like a bad dream, which one relates at breakfast. Their traditions and gifts are so dissimilar. Collaboration between them is, to me, inconceivable." Now, this collaboration, I'll read a short extract from Ford about how it went. Ford says, "We would write for whole days, for half nights, for half the day or all the night. We would jot down passages on scraps of paper on the margins of books. We would roar with laughter. Conrad would howl with rage. We would recoil one from the other and go each to our own cottage." Now, that's all fine, but others had to put up with this process. And Jessie Conrad, Conrad's wife, writes that for hours after I had gone to bed, the voices would reach me through the floor. Sounds of wordy strife and disagreement came distinctly into my room. Ford would thump on the beams, which woke her and vibrated. And one day he put his greasy summer Panama hat in her oven to dry over the Sunday joint she was cooking. He also hung his bed cover up as a curtain and wrapped himself for the night in Conrad's carefully pressed and ironed morning coat and striped trousers. Jessie and Ford did not always get on, though sometimes they did, oddly enough. Later, when Ford was recovering from his nervous breakdown, Conrad wrote to him, "I'm awfully grieved to hear of your state. Mine, though not identical, is just as bad." As I say, they weren't always nice to each other. Stephen Crane is a name not well known nowadays. He was another American, young American writer, war journalist and novelist, best known at the time for a book called The Red Badge of Courage. He's little read now, but he came over here in 1899, and he was with a lady he'd met in the Hotel de Dream in Jacksonville. She was called Cora. And he was 26, Cora was 34, she was twice married, and it's not quite clear whether the hotel was a hotel as we normally understand it, or actually a rather high-class brothel. It probably a little bit of a mixture of both, I suspect. But she and Crane have had a very solid and sound relationship. She's described by Ford as large, fair, and placid, and by James as slightly overblown, with a fleshly charm and an energetic pursuit of pleasure and society. Now, they saw Breed Place, which is over at Breed, and which you can see now from the footpath that goes past it, a fine and large house. It was rented from the local Fruin family, still a local family. The Fruin they particularly rented it from at that time was called Morton Fruin, and it is known as Mortal Ruin, apparently. They rented it for £40 a year, but on condition they kept on the staff, who were particularly troublesome and had to be bribed. The cook had to be bribed with brandy to get going, apparently. She was very good when she did. They were both pursued by debts throughout their lives, and yet they lived as though they weren't, and they entertained generously and constantly. Crane's appeal, all these other writers loved Crane. I suspect he was one of those people you had to have met to get his charm, because it's not clear from the photo of him. If we have a photo of Crane and Cora, sorry, that was the Pent, Conrad's house. I've got out of sync here. That's them. It's not immediately clear why everyone fell in love with Crane, but they did. Can we have Breed Place? I think that's next too. Next photo? Yes, Breed Place. There we are. It's pretty much what it's like now. Now, maybe you had to have met, as I say, to understand his charm. Ford said, "He's the most beautiful spirit I have known. Small, frail, energetic, at times virulent. He would fly at and deny every statement before it was out of your mouth. He wore breeches, riding leggings, spurs, a cowboy's shirt, and there was always a gun nearby him. He would swap flies with the bead sight of his revolver. He was such a beautiful genius. He did not seem to have the motives of common clay." Even Conrad, who wasn't always kind about other people, said he had a quiet smile that charmed and frightened one. The smile of a man who knows that his time will not be long upon this earth. He is the only impressionist writer, and really only an impressionist. Now, the house at that time was still much in its medieval state. It had rushes on the floor, almost no plumbing, drunken staff, as I said. Cora apparently slept in a queenly bed on a raised dais in the ballroom, and they had parties. H.G. Wells was famous for introducing a game with broomsticks to these parties. I don't know what it was, but it's probably pretty energetic. And he describes the Christmas in 1900 parties that they have. This went on, he says, for several days. There were only 3 or 4 bedrooms, he said, in use, but there were 30 or 40 guests. And the women were put on truckle beds in what became, they called the girls' dormitory, and the men in the attic. And Wells says the sanitary equipment dated from the 17th century, and such as there was indoors was accessible only through the girls' dormitory. Consequently, the wintry countryside next morning was dotted with wandering, melancholy, preoccupied men guests. They had theatricals and dances. They had candle sconces, but they didn't have any grease guards, so that everybody's back was apparently trapped in composite candle racks. And they revelled until the early hours. But at the end of the party, after several days, Crane, whilst playing the guitar, fainted and hemorrhaged. And that, for him, sadly, was the beginning of the end. Debts pursued them to Germany, but Cora was able to make enough money to get him to Germany in order where they hoped there might be a cure. They appealed to all their friends. Mortal Ruin Fruin was very generous. Henry James actually gave some money. Conrad appealed to described himself as a man without connections, without influence, without means. My future, such as it is already pawned. But they got to Germany, but sadly, Crane died there. He was brought back here, and Henry James wouldn't break off his writing routine to go across to Dover and receive the body, and wanted nothing to do with Cora afterwards. James's verdict on Breed Place was interesting. The house was popularly believed to be seriously haunted, and James described it as a conscious and cruel house, which is interesting. Also, Oscar Wilde pops up in terms of raising money. Crane himself was asked to help raise money for Wilde over his court case, but he refused to donate to it, saying that Wilde was what he called a mildewed chump. Now, can we have the next photo, please? I remember this. Yes, this is H.G. Wells as a younger man. Now, Wells, as I expect most of you will know, was of relatively humble origins in South London, Bromley. He had a Cockney accent, and he had a different approach to most of these others to writing, although Kipling may have had something of the same approach. Wells says of himself, I was full of mercenary go, price per thousand and saleable copy were present in my mind. My fight with the world for Jane and myself and my family had set up a premium upon money making. I was beginning to like the sport, to enjoy being able to pay for things. I was getting rather keen on my literary reputation as a saleable asset. Now, Wells lived in this part of the world, well, actually, quite a long way away, the other side of the marsh, at Sandgate, from 1898 to 1909. And he came to be there because he was on a South Coast cycling holiday with Jane, and he became ill and had to recover and convalesce at Sandgate. They rented a couple of houses, and then they had a house built called Spade House, which is rather fine. If we could, next photo, please. That's it. Wells, as I say, saw writing and art as a means to an end, to, in his case, wider social and political ends. Whereas Henry James and Ford and Conrad saw writing as an end in itself. There was long-standing mutual respect between them, especially between Wells and James. And it's interesting, I get the impression that James, who is the height of literary consciousness, probably thought more highly of Wells than he did of the others. And for Henry James, as Wells himself said, there were not so much novels as the novel. He thought of it as an art form and of novelists as a very special and exalted type. I was disposed to regard a novel as about as much an art form as a marketplace or a boulevard. And he did so very successfully. Their relationship, which as I say was quite good, but declined later because Wells published a parody of Henry James's style. And he described it as his writing as all tales, his later writing this is, as all tales of nothingness, a leviathan retrieving pebbles, a magnificent but painful hippopotamus, resolved at any cost, even at the cost of its dignity, upon picking up a pea which has got into the corner of its den. James found that hard to forgive. And this is Wells on Conrad too, describing Conrad. He says, wringing his hands and wrinkling his forehead. "What's all this about Jane Austen?" Conrad would say. "What is in her? What is it all about?" And as Wells says, to confound Conrad, one had only to say humour. It was one of our damned English tricks that he never learned to tackle. Now, James had a very energetic and almost Byzantine love life. Nothing much we can do about that, is there?
Well, I think it might reconnect. I don't know what's happening.
Yes.
Yeah, we're back on now.
Oh,
We're back on.
well, I understand you've lost us. We lost you, rather. And that now we're back on, I hope. But I don't know, do we know at which point we parted company?
We were on this slide.
We were on this slide, yes. A few minutes. Well, I'll wrap up on Wells, shall I? Perhaps I did Conrad, Wells on Conrad, maybe?
Yes.
Conrad couldn't understand Jane Austen. Wells's love life, energetic and Byzantine. He liked intellectual women, it seems, but he does quote one of them, or he does complain about one of them, who lectured him, he says, on philology and the lingering vestiges of my Cockney accent, while there was not a stitch between us. Now, let's move on, if we're still all here, as I hope we are, to Violet Hunt. Yes, good, there she is. What a hat. Now, Violet was born in 1862. She never lived on the Romney Marsh, but she knew James, Wells, and Ford well. And she had affairs with two of them. Well, she had an affair with Wells, and she lived with Ford from getting on for a decade later on. She was a very popular and prolific novelist, and she was an early feminist. She was well known for her London salon, and she was very much part of the London literary scene. And she features in a number of novels by former lovers who have based characters upon her, including Ford Madox Ford in his novel Parade's End, which was filmed down at Rye mainly. Now, her girlhood nickname was Immodest Violet, and it said that she would break off any anecdote to remind you of what she was wearing at the time. She was reportedly proposed to by Oscar Wilde, but most of her lovers, apart from Somerset Maugham, seem to have been older married men. She had one particular love of her life, which went on for quite a few years, a man called Oswald Crawford, a diplomat. And his wife was disabled and eventually died, and Violet clearly hoped that when he was widowed, he would marry her. He didn't, he married one of her friends. And all he left her with was, sadly, syphilis. She's described by those who knew her and liked her as indiscreet and impetuous, but she had a darting intelligence, but she was sometimes rather naive and artless. During her affair with Henry James, when she went down to stay with him and his wife Jane at Sandgate, she told Jane that she looked overworked, was no longer pretty, and did her hair wrongly. And then she commented in her diary, "I don't think she likes me." She was a frequent visitor to Lamb House, but she badly misread Henry James because she once attempted to seduce him. Now, a heterosexual seduction of Henry James is very hard to imagine indeed. But she says that she put on my white Liberty Chinese dressing gown, very pretty, and drifted, as I know how, into the drawing room, and from which James fled like a startled rabbit, apparently. Next morning over breakfast, she tried to discuss sex and free love with him, which, it's an odd thing to go with the bacon and eggs, you'd think, but there we are, she tried it. And James pointed at the portrait of his mother to one side, indicating that such things could not be discussed in front of his mother. Now, last one, as we're galloping on, we're getting near time, Edith Wharton. Now, Edith Wharton, also born in 1862, was American. She was brought up in the same kind of rather exalted social world as Henry James. And she was born Edith Jones. And it's said that her New York family, which were very well off in real estate, were the origin of the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. Her mother forbade her even to read novels until she was married, but she started writing them, and she wrote poetry as well. But she wasn't published. Her first novel was published when she was 50. So hope for many of us. She never lived here. She never lived on the Romney Marsh, and she didn't, I'm pleased to be able to say, have affairs or attempt to have affairs with any of the writers we've been talking about. But she did cross the Atlantic 60 times, which is quite something in those days. And she frequently visited. She was a great friend of James. She was miserably married, and she divorced after 28 years. She then had a passionate, in her middle age, she had a passionate affair with, an ultimately disappointing affair, with a bisexual Times journalist whom James had introduced her to. She remained living in Paris throughout the First World War, visiting the front line quite frequently, and doing a lot of war work with refugees, for which she was awarded the Légion d'honneur. Now, her novels were not only popular, but they earned critical acclaim. I mean, it's a rare combination, and she achieved it quite rightly. She was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize, and she was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize. And her novels are well worth reading now. Some people at the time regarded her as a kind of Henry James light, as though she was James's apprentice, but I think she's much better than that. She writes about many of the same things, only she does it rather more clearly and in a less convoluted way than James. In fact, she was very generous too, very generous. James, in despair as ever about his sales and thinking his publisher wouldn't want to publish his next novel, she secretly arranged with his publisher to pay James a very generous advance, $8,000, which was about 4 times what James had paid to buy Lamb House. And she paid that advance, and James never knew that she had subsidized him in this way. She records how, when she visited sometimes, she would take him out in her car, with her driver, of course, across the Romney Marsh. And she says, he took advantage to the last drop of petrol of the traveling capacity of any visitor's car. We always whirled miles away. James was as jubilant as a child. Everything pleased him. The easy locomotion, which often cradled him into a brief nap, the bosky softness of the landscape, the magic of ancient names. These he would murmur over and over to himself, finally creating characters to fit them, such as the Dims of Dymchurch, one of whom married a Sparkle and was the mother of little Priscilla Dim Sparkle. Now, what happened to them all? I'd better rush and finish so that we've got time for any questions or discussion afterwards. Crane, as we know, died in Germany, sadly, as a young man. Henry James remained in Lamb House, but died in London in 1916. Conrad settled in Canterbury, where he lived until dying in 1924. Wells moved back to London and died there in 1946. Kipling remained in Bateman's, but died in London in 1936. Violet Hunt died in London in 1942, Edith Wharton in France in 1937, and Ford, having enlisted despite being overage in the First World War, died in France in 1939. As for the novel, that great endeavor to tell ourselves the story of ourselves, well, that goes on in its various forms, with or without a capital letter. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
We do have a question.
We do.
We do have a question, Chris. So Chris asked, just choose only one book written by one of these authors. Which would it be?
Oh dear. Well, there's a lot to choose from. My favorite, and I must admit I'm biased here because I wrote a biography of Ford Madox Ford, would be his novel The Good Soldier, which is a masterpiece, and I think it's a wonderful novel, and it's always in print. Of Conrad, that's difficult because he wrote several great novels, but I think perhaps not Lord Jim, not Nostromo. I'll come back to Conrad. I find it a bit difficult to choose. With James, maybe The Golden Bowl. With Kipling, I'd have to go through them again to see which I think is the best one. As when I was younger, I used to love Stalky and Co., his account of his time at school. But I'll think again about that.
You might want to call me the ignorant American by this question. What exactly is Romney Marsh? What are the boundaries?
Well, it's an area east of here. Beyond it starts the other side of Rye, really, and goes on until you get to Hythe in Kent, and it extends inland, but not as far as Ashford. So it's a kind of semicircular area almost. And it used to be sea, of course. It was all sea at one time, and it was gradually the sea receded, and it left its marshland. And so that's what it is. You can drive across it, tomorrow afternoon. It's not very big, but it's big for features of southern England.
And the homes that you spoke of, all of them are still standing?
Yes, they're all still there. Bateman's and Lamb House are both National Trust houses, which you can visit when they're open. Pent Farmhouse is still there. I've been inside that, and Wells's house is still there too, and so is Ford's. They're all actually there, but you can't visit them all.
Right. So if you wanted to try to plot them on a map and try to find them, is it possible?
It's possible to do it. Yes, it's not at all difficult. Yeah. There's a book published in the 1990s called Writers and Their Houses, which has illustrations of most of these places, which, if you can ever find a copy, would help you get there.
Okay. What is the name again?
Writers and Their Houses. I'll lend it to you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
We have a question from Julia, who comments
Yes.
on the lots of infidelity and affairs amongst his writers. Do you think Kipling was more proper, she asks? The impression at Bateman's is a total devotion to his wife.
I think he probably was, yes. In fact, I don't know anything to suggest that there was ever any infidelity in that marriage. James, of course, never married, and nowadays he'd probably be considered a closet homosexual. But whether he actually had any sexual experiences, I don't know, and I don't know that his biographers have ever really decided. Wells, of course, we know all about. Conrad, I think, was probably a faithful marriage too, as far as I know. And Ford, well, Janice Biala, who was Ford's fourth wife, in inverted commas, once said to me that she said Ford wasn't really promiscuous in a physical sense, although literally he was, but he was emotionally promiscuous, and his emotional engagement would lead him on to other things.
Judy asks, what is it you think that brought them down here initially, apart from the railways?
Well, with Ford, it was having his in-laws living here. That was part of it. They were living on the Marsh, first of all, in various rented cottages. And that was partly to get away with things. And Ford had an idea about the rural idyll, that you could live a lovely, rural, simple life and be a great writer at the same time. It's always very difficult. And with Conrad, it was because Ford was here and knew about it and told him about it. And James fell in love with Rye. As he visited someone down here, and he just fell in love with the place. Kipling with Bateman's, as you know. So it's partly chance that led them all.
To the best of your knowledge, does Robert's Bridge crop up as a setting or even mentioned in any of the writer's works?
Can I just, somebody has pointed out here that they can't actually hear the question.
Oh, okay.
I think so.
Right.
Shall I repeat?
Yes. Well, the question was, has Robert's Bridge cropped up as a place in any of these writers' works? I'm not aware of it by that name. It might well be, and if it is, it will probably be Kipling or Ford, but I'm not aware of it.
Can I just ask something?
Yes.
Because I was very intrigued by the fact that Stephen Crane lived here. Because I mean, as a young man, I haven't read Badge of Courage, but as a young man, I saw a wonderful film which was made at the time of
Oh,
the
yes.
book,
Yes.
and starring Audie Murphy, I think, in the lead role, which is quite extraordinary because the hero of the book fought us. It's in the Civil War, isn't it? And
Yes.
he in fact, he runs away basically, and he receives his red badge of courage, which is the actual wound on his head through the act of cowardice. He's hit by a rifle, I think, when running away. But however, he redeems himself, of course, and becomes the hero of the piece in the end. But rather extraordinary, the fact that Murphy was the chap who played him was the most decorated, highly decorated American soldier of World War
Oh, was
II.
he? Was he?
And
Yes.
incredible, he won about 13 awards, including
Yes.
the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he played that part, which is amazing. But that was good. You asked a little earlier about Noakes
Yes.
and the fact that the chap had been a boxer.
Yes.
When I was in the 50s, I joined Battle Boxing Club, and that was run by Bobby Noakes,
Ah,
who was a boxer too.
so I
So I
wonder.
wonder if maybe because of that
Yes.
connection,
I
whether
wonder.
it was part
Yeah.
of the same family.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, be worth finding out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
That's all the questions. Wonderful. That was
Thank you.
incredibly interesting. I want to plot all the houses and
And good night.
go look at them.
Don't worry. Anyway, thank you.